Where are you listening to me from? And what hour of the night has found you awake? I ask because nights have always been kinder to women like me. During the day, the world spoke loudly, with laws, with certainty, with names already decided. But at night, thoughts were allowed to finish themselves. I was born into words, into rooms heavy with books that were never written for me. I learned early how to listen without being invited, how to understand without being acknowledged. In my world, a woman survived by knowing when silence could protect her.
I, too, learned the value of the night. The palace never truly sleeps, but it does grow quieter, and in quiet, intention becomes visible. I was born into order, into corridors where every step was observed, and every pause was remembered. I learned early that power does not always shout. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it watches. In my world, a woman survived by knowing when silence could command.
We lived in the same empire, under the same sky, bound by the same rules that were never written for us. I did not rule. I did not command. I wrote, because writing was the only space where my mind could move freely. I believed knowledge could outlive fear.
I did not write. I did not teach. I decided, because hesitation in my world cost lives. I believed restraint could preserve a nation.
They will tell you that there is only one way for a woman to be strong. They are wrong.
Strength wears many disguises. Some of them are quiet enough to survive history.
Tonight, I will tell you my story, not as a heroine, not as a rebel, but as a woman who chose endurance over disappearance.
And I will tell you mine, not as an empress, not as a legend, but as a woman who chose stability over glory.
We did not
choose the same path, but we walked them at the same time. Listen carefully. This is not the story of one woman. It is the story of two kinds of power, both silent, both dangerous, both real.
I was born into a house full of words that were never meant to become mine. They surrounded me long before I understood their meaning, stacked on shelves, rolled carefully in wooden cases, spoken aloud in voices trained to sound certain. In my earliest memory, I am not the center of the room. I am near a doorway, standing still enough to be forgotten, close enough to hear everything. The house breathed quietly, not with warmth, but with discipline. Ink was prepared each morning with the same care others reserved for prayer. Brushes were cleaned, aligned, returned to their places. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was wasted. Words mattered here, and yet no one imagined they might one day matter to me. I was loved. I must say that first. I was fed, protected, corrected gently when necessary. No hand was raised. No cruelty announced itself, but expectation flowed past me, as if I were not standing there. It moved naturally toward my brothers, toward futures spoken aloud, toward lives already outlined in confident sentences. Mine remained unnamed. As a child, I did not understand the significance of this. I only felt the shape of it. I learned early where I could sit without interrupting thought, where my presence did not require acknowledgement. Doorways became my classrooms. Silence became my posture. I listened to arguments unfold with a patience no one had taught me. I followed the rise and fall of voices, the pauses that meant disagreement, the pauses that meant authority. I learnt that certainty has a rhythm. Scrolls were opened slowly, as though sudden movement might disturb the past itself. Sometimes a passage was read twice, not because it was unclear, but because it deserved to be weighed. I weighed it with them, not aloud, not visibly. In my mind, sentences arranged themselves into structure. Ideas connected, patterns formed. No one noticed. That invisibility was my first education. I did not touch the scrolls. I did not need to. Words entered me through repetition, through proximity, through the simple fact of being there longer than anyone expected. At night, when the house quieted and lamps burned lower, I replayed entire conversations in memory. I tested arguments silently. I adjusted conclusions. I learned how meaning shifts depending on who is allowed to speak it. I did not yet know that this was learning. I believed I was only waiting. Waiting was safe. No one interrupts a girl who appears content to wait. And so my mind grew. In spaces no one was watching. I was born where words lived. But I was not invited to claim them, so I learned another way. I listened. My childhood did not announce itself through milestones. There were no moments declared important. At the time they occurred, it unfolded quietly, day after day, within the same walls that had already decided who mattered. Morning arrived gently in our house. Light filtered through wooden lattices, settling first on the floor, then climbing the walls, as if testing whether the room was awake. I learned the movement of that light before I learned the shape of written characters. I knew where warmth gathered in winter, where shade lingered in summer, and which corners allowed a child to remain unseen without being suspected. Scrolls were everywhere. They rested against walls, lay stacked on low tables, waited in boxes that smelled of age and care. They were not hidden from me. They were simply not relevant to my existence. No one said I must not read. They assumed I would not need to. As a child, I did not experience this as exclusion. I experienced it as distance. Distance creates curiosity. I sat where I was placed. I remained where silence made me acceptable. From there, the world revealed itself in fragments. Men read aloud. Their voices were steady, practiced, trained to carry authority without strain. Sometimes a sentence was paused over, not because it was unclear, but because it carried weight. I felt that weight. Ink brushes moved with discipline. They did not rush toward expression. They waited for intention. I learned the sound of the brush when it lifted from the page. A soft, final whisper, as if the words themselves had been asked to remain still. I did not touch the scrolls, not out of fear, out of instinct. Even as a child, I understood the difference between what was possible and what was permitted. Instead, I traced characters in my mind. I followed arguments from memory. I reconstructed discussions long after voices left the room. Memory became my archive. At times, I would sit alone after others had gone, surrounded by the quiet residue of thought. The room felt different then, less authoritative, more open. It was as if the words, having been spoken, had not yet decided where to settle. I did not yet know that I was learning. I believed I was simply waiting. Waiting teaches its own discipline. It sharpens attention without promising reward. No one praised my silence. No one corrected it. That balance allowed it to deepen. I learned when silence meant permission, and when it meant warning. I learned how long a pause could last before it became inappropriate. These lessons were not written, they were absorbed. Other children learned their place through play. I learned mine through observation. Occasionally, someone noticed me, a glance, a pause in speech. Then the conversation continued, unchanged. That taught me something important. I was visible enough to be acknowledged, invisible enough to be harmless. In that narrow space, I became precise. Precision is not loud. It does not ask for attention. It waits until it is needed. As my childhood passed, I began to sense that knowledge was not fixed. It shifted depending on who held it, who spoke it, who recorded it. History was not simply remembered, it was arranged. That realization stayed with me. I did not want to speak yet. I wanted to understand how speaking changed things. So I continued to listen, scroll by scroll, room by room, day by day, learning without permission and without resistance, because no one resists a child who appears content to remain quiet. I cannot tell you the exact moment when I understood that I was different. There was no sentence spoken aloud, no rule announced. Difference did not arrive as an event. It settled. It settled the way dust settles, on surfaces that are never meant to be moved. Slowly, evenly, until one day you realize that everything carries the same fine weight. At first, I sensed it in voices. When men spoke to one another, their words were sharpened by expectation. They assumed response. They assumed resistance. When they spoke to me, their voices softened, rounded at the edges, as if clarity mattered less than comfort. To my brothers, instruction was brief. Correction assumed understanding. To me, explanation was complete, final, as though nothing further would ever be required of my thoughts. I understood then, without resentment, that my intelligence was not doubted, it was unnecessary, and what is unnecessary is rarely protected. I noticed difference in questions. Visitors asked my brothers what they were studying, which paths they intended to follow. They asked me whether I was well, whether I was obedient, whether I was content. Contentment, I learned, was the measure by which women were judged. Not curiosity, not insight. One afternoon, I stood near the threshold of a room where a discussion unfolded. It was not dramatic, not urgent. A disagreement about interpretation, a careful exchange of ideas. I understood every word, not because I was gifted, but because I had listened long enough to recognize the structure beneath the argument. For a brief moment, a response formed in my mind, clear, precise, ready. It did not occur to me to speak it aloud. The thought dissolved before it reached my mouth. Silence had already chosen for me. That realization did not wound me. It clarified. I understood that speaking was not forbidden. It was irrelevant. A woman's thoughts were permitted as long as they remained private. Unexpressed intelligence was not threatening. That distinction shaped everything that followed. I began to watch the women around me more carefully. Older women who moved confidently through routines perfected by repetition. Younger women who learned quickly how to soften their presence, how to adjust before being corrected. None of them were foolish. None of them were empty. They were skilled at anticipation, at avoiding friction, at keeping the world smooth enough to survive within it. I did not pity them. Pity blurs vision. I studied them. Observation sharpens it. I learned that resistance carried cost, long before it carried meaning. Women who resisted openly were remembered briefly, then reduced to warnings. Women who adapted quietly were rarely remembered at all, but they endured. Between resistance and erasure existed a narrow passage. I felt it then, even before I had language for it, a way of moving through the world without colliding with it, not by shrinking, but by turning sideways at the right moments. Understanding difference did not make me bitter. It made me precise. I stopped imagining myself as an exception. I began to understand myself as a reader of terrain. Terrain can be crossed if it is mapped carefully, and so I adjusted. Not because I believed the limits were just, but because I recognized their shape. This was not surrender. It was orientation. And orientation, once established, allows movement. Marriage did not arrive as a turning point. It arrived as a rearrangement. No one asked me whether I was ready. Readiness was assumed to be unnecessary. The decision was delivered calmly, as one delivers information that has already been agreed upon. There was no argument to be made, no refusal to be imagined. The household adjusted around the decision with a familiarity that required no explanation. Clothes were folded differently. Objects were assigned new places. My name was spoken in sentences that no longer included the future. I observed this quietly. By then, I understood that some changes do not announce themselves as loss. They present themselves as order. Leaving my father's house did not feel like departure. It felt like relocation, the same customs, the same expectations, a narrower space in which to move. My husband was not cruel. That detail matters. Cruelty creates conflict. This created boundaries. He expected competence, efficiency, calm. Conversation was neither encouraged nor forbidden. It was simply unnecessary. I learned quickly how much silence a household can contain without appearing empty. Days became structured around repetition. Meals prepared, rooms arranged, tasks completed with precision. Repetition has a way of shrinking the horizon without drawing attention to itself. The world did not become hostile. It became contained. There were fewer rooms where thought could wander freely, fewer voices worth listening to. But thought does not disappear when space contracts. It concentrates. At night, after the household had settled into sleep, I lay awake, listening. Different footsteps, different pauses. I learned this new silence the way I had learned the old one. By accepting it first, then understanding it. Marriage required alignment, not devotion, not passion, alignment. I adjusted my movements, my timing, my expectations, not because I believed this life was ideal, but because it was survivable. Survival does not always look dramatic. Often, it looks like discipline. Within the smaller world, my attention sharpened. I noticed patterns more quickly. I wasted less energy. I learned to carry my thoughts without friction. This was not the life I would have chosen if choice had been available, but it was a life that could be inhabited without disappearance, and so I inhabited it fully, not with hope, not with resistance, with awareness. The world had become smaller, my mind had become denser. My husband's death did not arrive with violence. It arrived as thinning days grew quieter around him. Before they disappeared entirely, his presence loosened its hold on the household, gradually, as though the world itself were learning how to continue. Before I was. When he died, nothing collapsed. The walls remained, the routines resumed. That continuity was unsettling. I had expected grief to feel heavy. Instead, it felt hollow. Space opened where expectation had lived. I was no longer someone's future. I became someone's remainder. People spoke to me differently then. Their voices softened further, as though I had become fragile by definition. They assumed sorrow. They assumed withdrawal. They assumed I would remain. Sympathy replaced direction. And sympathy, I discovered, is a peculiar form of freedom. No one asked what I would do next. No path was outlined on my behalf. For the first time in my life, nothing was being prepared for me. I existed outside projection. This did not feel like liberation. Liberation celebrates. This felt like detachment. Time stretched. Silence deepened. Not the silence that avoids, but the silence that listens inward. I did not rush to fill it. Grief hovered, present, undemanding. I acknowledged it without performance. Tears came when they came. They did not insist. Urgency had left with obligation. In the evenings, I found myself awake longer, not restless, attentive. Thoughts I had carried quietly for years began to rearrange themselves. Without the daily requirement of alignment, my mind expanded inward. Memory resurfaced. Conversations long past. Arguments never spoken. Ideas paused indefinitely. Widowhood did not grant me permission to speak, but it removed the need to be agreeable. That difference mattered. I was no longer being assessed for usefulness as a wife. I had become socially neutral. Neutrality makes a woman invisible. Invisibility, when understood, becomes space. I did not yet know what this space would become. I only knew that something inside me was reorienting, not toward freedom, toward purpose. Silence had deepened, and in that depth, direction began to form. Returning to my father's house did not feel like stepping backward. It felt like standing upright again. After years of adjusting my posture to fit a narrower space, I crossed the threshold without ceremony, without explanation. No one asked why I had come back. Widowhood answers such questions in advance. The house received me the way it had always received things, without surprise. The rooms were unchanged. The walls still held their quiet weight. The air carried the same discipline I remembered from childhood. And yet, I moved through it differently. I was no longer the girl who hovered near doorways, hoping not to be noticed. I was a woman who understood how much space silence could contain. I did not announce intention. Intention invites resistance. Instead, I resumed proximity, near the work, near the scrolls, near the slow shaping of thought. My brother lived inside history, not as curiosity, but as responsibility. The past was not admired in this house, it was maintained. Texts were copied, corrected, aligned. Errors were weighed carefully. Continuity mattered more than brilliance. I stood nearby. Standing nearby had always been my method. I listened as drafts were read aloud, as passages were reconsidered, as meanings shifted slightly under the pressure of new attention. Nothing was dramatic, nothing needed to be. I began to assist, without naming the assistants. I remembered details others forgot, not because they were insignificant, but because no one else had learned to carry them patiently. I organized fragments. I restored sequence. I connected notes that had lost their companions. When I spoke, I did so as recollection, as suggestion, never as correction. My brother accepted these contributions without comment. That silence mattered. There was no acknowledgement that a boundary had been crossed, because no boundary had been named. I did not sit among scholars. I remained close enough to influence structure without inviting challenge. In that narrow space between presence and absence, I learned how history is assembled, what is preserved, what is softened, what is left unresolved, because resolution would invite dispute. I saw how authority hides itself inside coherence, how a narrative gains legitimacy, not through certainty, but through balance. For the first time, my mind was not merely receiving, it was shaping quietly, relentlessly. Returning to my father's house did not restore something I had lost. It revealed something that had been forming all along. Knowledge had never excluded me, only recognition had. And recognition, I was beginning to understand, is negotiable. My brother's death did not arrive without warning. Illness teaches those who pay attention how absence prepares itself. By the time he was gone, the house already knew how to be quieter. What remained was not grief alone, but interruption. Scrolls lay open, as if expecting a return that would not come. Sentences ended mid-thought. Arguments paused without resolution. History had been left exposed. People came to mourn. They lowered their voices. They spoke of loss. Then they left. The work remained. At first, I did nothing. Not from hesitation, from restraint. Grief has its own order. To disturb it too quickly distorts what follows. But what is left unattended does not remain neutral. It begins to unravel. I started with arrangement, not writing, not revising, simply restoring sequence. Fragments returned to their places. Notes found their companions. Margins revealed intentions long deferred. My hands moved before my thoughts named the act. This kind of labor was familiar to me, invisible, unclaimed. The kind women had always done, except this time it carried the weight of centuries. Days passed. The work did not resist me. It seemed to recognize continuity. I did not impose myself upon the text. I aligned with it. History does not tolerate intrusion. It requires discipline. I understood that instinctively as I worked. A realization settled slowly, without drama. If I did not complete this history, someone else would. Someone less patient, less careful, less familiar with its internal balance. The thought did not frighten me. It clarified I began to write, cautiously at first. Each sentence tested against what came before. Each decision weighed for what it preserved and what it displaced. Writing ceased to be expression. It became obligation, not to my brother, not to my family. To the work itself, authority arrived quietly, not as permission granted, but as responsibility assumed. No one declared me the keeper of this history. There was no moment of recognition, but the past began to hold. It stopped unraveling. In restoring its continuity, I felt my own take shape. I was no longer standing near history. I was inside it, not as a subject, not as a name, as a hand, steady enough to carry what could not be dropped without consequence. And once taken up, the work could not be set down again. The court did not summon me abruptly. Power rarely rushes. It observes first, measures, decides whether attention is worth the risk it brings with it. When the invitation came, it arrived wrapped in courtesy, formal, restrained, crafted so carefully that refusal would have sounded like ignorance. I understood immediately that this was not recognition. It was exposure. To enter the court is not to be welcomed. It is to be positioned where eyes can reach you without admitting they are watching. The palace breathed differently. From any house I had known, air moved with intention. Sound carried memory. Footsteps echoed longer than they should have, as though the stone floors themselves had been trained to listen. Everything here had already been decided before anyone spoke. Women were everywhere, and yet none of them were central. They moved gracefully through corridors, their gestures measured, their expressions carefully unfinished. They were closer to power than most men would ever be, and yet they touched none of it. I was given no title of consequence. Titles protect. They also trap. Instead, I was placed close enough to hear conversations, far enough to remain unthreatening. That placement was intentional. At court, intelligence is tolerated. Only when it does not announce itself. I spoke little. Listening had always kept me alive. I learned quickly that truth was not the currency of this place. Alignment was. What mattered was not what was correct, but what could be accepted without disturbing the surface. Advice never arrived directly. It moved sideways, through precedent, through recollection, through silence held at precisely the right moment. I adapted. I learned when to lower my eyes and when to hold a gaze, just long enough to suggest attention, not challenge. I learned to speak in sentences that could be withdrawn without consequence. Plausible humility became my armor. At court, danger does not announce itself. It waits. I watched women rise and disappear without ever knowing which gesture had sealed their fate. A word spoken too clearly. A pause held too long. I resolved to leave no visible trace. My role narrowed. I was asked to explain, to contextualize, to recall precedent, never to decide. That distinction preserved me. Power brushed past me often, close enough to feel its heat, never close enough to burn. I understood then that proximity is not access, and access is never safety. I did not belong to the court. I functioned within it, and that difference would keep me alive. They never said I was there to teach. Nothing dangerous is named plainly at court. They said I was there to guide conduct, to clarify tradition, to assist in refinement, words chosen carefully, so that nothing sounded new. The women who sat before me did not look confused. They did not look hopeful either. They looked attentive. That mattered more. They lived closer to power than most men ever would, and yet were permitted to touch none of it. They had learned, as I had, that proximity is not protection. I did not speak to them of ambition. Ambition attracts correction. I did not speak to them of freedom. Freedom was not available. I spoke, instead of timing, of restraint, of reading a room before reading a text. I taught them how to notice. When praise was a warning, when kindness came with conditions, when silence was safer than response. These lessons were not written. They could not be. They lived in tone, in pause, in what was left unsaid. I did not promise them change. Promises create disappointment. I offered clarity. Clarity sharpens instinct. Instinct keeps one intact. They asked few questions. The questions they asked were precise. How long to wait? When to speak? When to withdraw? I answered without absolutes. Absolutes break easily. What I gave them could not be repeated without losing meaning. That made it safe. For them, for me, at times, the contradiction pressed heavily. I was teaching women how to endure a system that constrained them. Was I preserving it, or was I ensuring that fewer women were broken by it? I did not resolve the question. Resolution invites certainty. Certainty invites exposure. At court, hesitation is dangerous, but doubt, held quietly, is useful. So I continued. Woman to woman, without witnesses, not shaping a future, not building a movement, simply making the present survivable. And in that quiet exchange, I recognized a different kind of legacy. Not loud, not visible, but cumulative. I did not write lessons for women because I believed the world was just. I wrote it because I understood exactly how unjust it was. By then, I knew the limits of speech. What could be said openly would be rejected. What could not be rejected would never be allowed to exist. So I chose a different path. Not confrontation, not refusal, calculation. I wrote in a language men already trusted. Harmony, order, obedience, words that moved freely through households and halls because they sounded familiar, reassuring, safe. That safety was intentional. Safety disarms scrutiny. Inside those words, I placed something else. Education. Quietly, I wrote that a woman must learn, not to challenge, not to command, but to understand. Understanding was framed as duty, as preparation, as responsibility, never as power. A woman who seeks power is watched. A woman who seeks competence is tolerated. So I wrote for tolerance. Every sentence carried two meanings, one visible, one waiting. On the surface, the text appeared to reinforce order. Beneath it, it required attention, memory, discipline. To follow its guidance properly, a woman would have to think. That was not an accident. I knew the text would live without me. Read aloud in quiet rooms. passed from mother to daughter, quoted selectively, often without context. I could not control how it would be used, only how it was built, so I made it resilient. Simple enough to survive repetition, complex enough to resist emptiness. I understood the risk, that my words could be used to demand obedience without understanding, that they could be taken and stripped of intention, but silence carried a greater danger. An uneducated woman has no leverage at all. If my writing kept women reading, thinking, observing, even within constraint, then it had done its work. I did not write for approval. Approval fades. I wrote for continuation. If women could read, they could remember. If they could remember, they could adapt. And adaptation, I had learned, is how history truly moves. I released the text without explanation. Explanation invites debate. Debate invites control. Let it be misunderstood. Let it be argued over. What mattered was that it existed, and once it existed, it could not be erased. There were moments, quiet, unrecorded moments, when I considered how I would be judged, not by those who lived beside me. They were too close to see clearly. By those who would come later, armed with distance, with words I never possessed, with choices I never had. Would they say I obeyed too easily? That I accepted limits I should have resisted? Would they call my caution weakness? I asked myself these questions without urgency. Urgency belongs to those who believe they have options. I had learned early that options rarely arrive whole. They come fragmented, conditional, bound to consequence. I did not believe obedience was virtuous. Virtue is a luxury of safety. I believed obedience was efficient. Efficiency keeps one intact long enough to matter. Still, the contradiction remained. I had written rules for women in a world that already confined them. I had taught restraint. To those already restrained, was that preservation or surrender? I turned the question slowly, like an object that refuses to show a single face. I thought of women who resisted openly. Their courage was undeniable, their survival brief. History remembered them loudly, then reduced them to symbols. I thought of women who obeyed without thought. Their lives passed quietly, leaving no trace at all. Between these two paths was a narrow passage, uncelebrated, uncomfortable, but continuous. That was the passage I chose, not because it was noble, but because it endured. I did not confuse endurance with righteousness. I only recognized its power. History is not shaped only by those who confront it. It is also shaped by those who adapt without being consumed. I knew the rules I described could be used against women. I also knew that without education, women would have no defense whatsoever. A rule can be bent if it is understood. Ignorance offers no such leverage. If my words kept a woman reading, thinking, observing, then they had done their work. Judgment, I understood, comes most easily from those who never had to calculate survival. I did not ask to be forgiven. I did not ask to be praised. I accepted that my legacy would never be singular. Some would see caution, others compromise. A few, very few, might recognize strategy. That was enough. I had never needed unanimity, only continuation. And so I lived with the contradiction, as I had lived with silence, not as a burden, but as terrain, mapped carefully, crossed deliberately.
I was not born into silence. I was born into order. Order has its own noise, the measured sound of footsteps in corridors, the careful spacing of words, the discipline of faces that reveal nothing. From the beginning, I understood that nothing in my world was accidental. Where a person stood, how long they paused, what they chose not to say, all of it meant something. I was born into a family that understood proximity to power, not power itself. That would have been dangerous. But closeness. Closeness requires restraint. As a child, I learned to sit without shifting, to listen without reacting, to notice without being noticed. No one praised this. It was expected. Expectation is a heavier teacher than punishment. I learned early that attention is never neutral. To be seen too clearly is to invite interpretation. Interpretation invites control. So I learned how to be visible without becoming legible. The palace was not yet my home, but its logic was already familiar to me. Hierarchy did not need to be explained. It revealed itself in movement. Who walked first? Who waited? Who spoke only after silence had been granted? I did not resist this world. Resistance wastes energy. I studied it. I learned how quickly favor shifts, how easily certainty dissolves. I learned that power does not announce its arrival. It accumulates. Quietly, I was taught propriety, ritual, obedience, not as virtue, but as survival. Emotion was not forbidden. It was irrelevant. What mattered was control. Control of voice, control of expression, control of reaction. I learned that a woman in my position was never truly powerless. She was simply constrained. Constraint demands intelligence. It demands timing. I did not dream of change. Dreams are loud. I focused instead on stability. Stability is what allows a structure to survive pressure. From the beginning, I understood something others learned too late. In a world built on hierarchy, the most dangerous person is not the one who challenges it. It is the one who understands how it functions. I intended to be that person. I entered the palace without ceremony. There was no moment I would later remember as the beginning. Beginnings are for those who believe they are about to become something new. I did not. I understood that the palace does not transform those who enter it. It reveals them. The first thing I noticed was the absence of disorder, not calm, control. Every sound belonged where it was. Every movement had been rehearsed, long before it was performed. Even hesitation felt regulated. Women were everywhere. Servants, attendants, consorts. They filled corridors, stood behind screens, waited at the edges of rooms where decisions were spoken softly. They were close enough to feel the heat of power, never close enough to shape it. I watched them carefully, not to judge, to understand. Some believed visibility was safety. They adorned themselves carefully, measured their smiles, competed for attention. They did not last. Others disappeared deliberately. They spoke little, moved slowly, made themselves unremarkable. They lasted longer, but changed nothing. I learned quickly that survival and influence were not the same thing. Influence requires access. Access requires trust. Trust is not granted to those who want it. It is granted to those who appear not to need it. I began to understand how the palace listens. It listens for disturbance, for imbalance, for ambition that cannot be concealed. I concealed mine by not naming it. I did not rush to be noticed. I did not rush to speak. I observed patterns. Who was consulted after decisions were made? who was ignored when questions were asked, who survived shifts in favor without explanation. I learned that power does not move in lines, it circles, it tests, it waits to see. Who remains consistent when nothing is promised? I made myself consistent, reliable, predictable in demeanor, unpredictable in thought. Emotion was a liability here, not because it was forbidden, but because it was readable. I trained my expression to reveal nothing that could be interpreted too quickly. I learned when to lower my eyes and when to hold a gaze, long enough to signal attention, not challenge. The palace does not reward brilliance, it rewards alignment. Alignment with timing, with expectation, with the unspoken agreement to maintain the surface at all costs. I did not mistake this for morality, it was mechanism. And mechanisms can be used once they are understood. By the time others began to notice me, I had already learned how to remain where I was placed without being fixed there. I had not gained power, but I had gained orientation. And orientation, in a place like this, is everything. Marriage did not elevate me. It narrowed the margin for error. When I became the emperor's wife, the world did not open. It tightened. Every movement acquired consequence. Every silence acquired interpretation. I was no longer simply observed. I was measured. The palace changed its posture toward me, not with warmth, but with recalculation. I understood immediately that proximity to power does not grant authority. It magnifies risk. The emperor was not cruel. That distinction matters. Cruelty creates enemies. This created expectations. I was expected to embody stability, to absorb tension without reflecting it, to remain constant while circumstances shifted. Affection was not required. Discretion was. I learned how quickly intimacy becomes vulnerability in a place that records everything. So I kept my interior sealed, not closed, contained. I listened more than I spoke. I watched how decisions formed before they were announced. I learned which advisors were tolerated and which were merely endured. I learned how often certainty masks fear. At times, power brushed close enough to reveal its texture. Not decisive, reactive, not omniscient, surrounded by uncertainty. That understanding changed nothing outwardly. It changed everything inwardly. I did not offer counsel, unless it could be framed as preservation. Preservation is difficult to oppose. I did not challenge direction. I adjusted pace. Speed determines damage. I learned that restraint, applied at the right moment, can redirect outcomes without appearing to interfere. My presence became predictable. Predictability disarms suspicion. Suspicion is the true currency of the palace. I did not seek to be loved. Love attracts scrutiny. I sought to be trusted as someone who would not destabilize the surface. Trust, here, meant survival. I did not mistake this role for insignificance. Insignificance goes unnoticed. I was noticed, carefully. Marriage placed me near power, without illusion. It showed me exactly how fragile authority can be when surrounded by ambition. And it taught me something I would carry forward. In a structure this rigid, the safest influence is the one that leaves no visible mark. The emperor's death did not create chaos, it revealed it. What followed was not confusion, but exposure. Suddenly, decisions that had once been deferred had nowhere to wait. Voices that had spoken confidently grew careful. Eyes that had watched from a distance began to look directly at me. I had become a widow, and something else. Not by choice, by necessity. Power does not ask whether you are prepared. It arrives when the alternative is collapse. The air was young, too young to carry the weight that had already begun to shift. Someone had to stand still while the structure settled. That someone was me. I did not announce authority. I absorbed it. The court did not suddenly trust me. Trust is slow, but uncertainty was faster. In moments of uncertainty, the one who remains calm becomes central. I spoke less, but my words began to hold, not because they were forceful, but because they arrived without urgency. Urgency alarms, calm stabilizes. I understood quickly that regency was not rule. It was containment. Containment of ambition, containment of fear, containment of the instinct to seize advantage, while the future hesitated. I did not try to reshape the empire. Reshaping invites resistance. I focused on continuity. Taxes were moderated, punishments restrained, military actions delayed, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. An exhausted population cannot sustain authority. An anxious court cannot make sound decisions. I listened to advisers who spoke too much, to those who spoke too little. I learned which concerns were real and which were rehearsed. Power, I discovered, does not reveal itself in arguments. It reveals itself in what people fear losing. I made myself difficult to read, not distant, deliberate. I did not reward loyalty loudly. I did not punish dissent publicly. Visibility distorts motive. Instead, I maintained balance. Balance is unspectacular. That is its strength. There were moments when I felt the pressure directly, when a decision could have turned the court against itself. In those moments, I remembered something simple. The empire did not need brilliance. It needed time. Time to breathe. Time to recover. Time for the future to grow into itself. So I governed quietly. Not as an empress in name, but as a presence that prevented fracture. Power could no longer be avoided, so I held it, without claiming it. I did not sit on the throne. That absence was deliberate. A throne invites challenge. It sharpens ambition. It asks others to measure themselves against you. I chose something else. I let the throne remain symbolic, while authority moved quietly around it. Decisions passed through my hands without carrying my name. That anonymity mattered. When outcomes are calm, few ask who shaped them. I learned quickly that governance is not command. It is calibration. Too much force, and the structure fractures. Too little, and it dissolves into opportunism. I adjusted weight carefully. Taxes were reduced, not to earn favor, but to relieve pressure. Pressure creates unrest long before it becomes visible. Military actions were restrained, not because strength was lacking, but because strength, used carelessly, destroys what it claims to protect. I watched advisers closely. Those who demanded urgency often sought advantage. Those who spoke of patience understood consequence. I rewarded neither openly. Reward distorts motive. Instead, I created consistency. Consistency teaches behavior more effectively than punishment. I did not seek reform that could be named. Named reforms attract opposition. I sought correction that could be absorbed. Small adjustments, quiet reversals, delays that allowed tempers to cool and intentions to reveal themselves. The court learned that volatility found no audience. Ambition learned to slow itself. I understood that fear, not loyalty, is what destabilizes empires. Fear of loss, fear of exposure, fear of being replaced. I reduced fear by reducing spectacle. Nothing here was sudden. Nothing needed applause. When mistakes occurred, they were addressed without humiliation. Humiliation breeds enemies. Correction, delivered privately, creates compliance. Some called this softness. They were wrong. Softness yields. This was control. Control that did not announce itself as domination. At times, I felt the strain of invisibility. To govern without recognition requires confidence without validation. But validation is addictive. Addiction weakens judgment. I had no interest in being remembered for brilliance. I was interested in leaving behind a structure that still stood. Authority without noise does not inspire songs. It inspires continuity, and continuity in an empire as old and fragile as ours was the highest achievement available. Power teaches many lessons. Most of them arrive too late. One of them arrives quietly and is almost always ignored. There is a moment when staying becomes more dangerous than leaving. I recognized that moment before others named it. The empire had steadied. The court had learned a new rhythm. Fear had retreated from the edges of conversation. Stability had returned, not because I remained visible, but because I no longer needed to be. That was the signal. I did not wait for gratitude. Gratitude creates obligation, and obligation binds. I did not wait for resistance either. Resistance sharpens too quickly. Once power overstays its welcome. Instead, I loosened my hold gradually. Decisions passed more often through others' hands. My presence became less central, less expected. I allowed the structure to function without me. This was not retreat, it was transfer. Those who cling to power believe departure erases achievement. They are mistaken. Overextension erases legacy far more efficiently. I had seen it happen. Men who governed well for years, only to be undone by the refusal to step aside. I had no desire to become such a lesson. I trusted the work I had done, not because it was perfect, but because it was absorbed. Absorbed systems do not collapse. When one person leaves, they continue. Some misread my withdrawal as weakness. That misreading protected me. It allowed others to move forward without feeling overshadowed. Power that chooses to leave does not provoke pursuit. It dissolves into structure. I did not mourn my authority. Authority was never my identity. It was a task, taken up, completed, set down. When I stepped back, nothing dramatic occurred. That was the proof that the timing was correct. The empire did not notice my absence, and that, for someone who had held power, was the highest confirmation possible. In my later years, nothing remarkable occurred. That was not disappointment. It was confirmation. The court no longer turned toward me for direction. It no longer hesitated in my absence. Decisions continued. Rituals held. Disputes resolved themselves. Without urgency, the structure stood. That was the work. I lived more quietly then. Not withdrawn, unrequired. There is a difference. I was not consulted for authority. I was consulted for memory, for precedent, for restraint. Those are not glamorous requests. They are reliable ones. I did not correct often. Correction, at that stage, would have suggested dependence. Instead, I listened. Listening had always been my most effective position. I observed how quickly people forget. Who held power once, stability feels normal. That forgetting did not trouble me. Power that must be remembered has already failed. My body weakened gradually. Without drama, strength left me the way authority had, incrementally, without announcement. I did not issue final instructions. Final instructions invite revision. What needed to be done had already been absorbed into routine. When death approached, it did not interrupt anything. That continuity mattered. I did not leave behind a singular image of myself. No grand narrative, no legend carefully shaped. What I left was quieter. An empire that did not fracture. When uncertainty arrived, institutions that did not depend on one voice. Stability is not inspiring. It does not travel easily through story, but it endures. I was not remembered as a conqueror or a visionary. I was remembered, when remembered at all, as someone whose time passed without catastrophe. That is not failure. That is control, exercised precisely enough to become invisible. And invisibility, when chosen, is power completed.
I did not command an empire. I never held a title that could bend others to my will. My power lived elsewhere, in rooms where no one thought. A woman was listening, in words chosen carefully enough to survive being misunderstood. I worked with what was allowed to remain. I shaped what could not be erased. I believed endurance was a form of intelligence. And yet, as I looked toward the life of the woman who stood closer to the throne than I ever did, I recognized something I never held: immediacy. She changed outcomes while they were still forming. She prevented harm before it required explanation. I wrote for generations I would never meet. She decided for people who were already waiting. I needed time. She needed precision.
I did not leave behind books. I did not teach daughters how to read between lines. My work vanished into the shape of stability. I governed without applause, without signature, often without acknowledgement. I believed restraint was a form of responsibility. And yet, as I consider the life of the woman who chose the pen over proximity, I recognize something I never possessed: duration. Her words traveled long after decisions faded. They adapted. They endured reinterpretation. I acted within a moment that could not be postponed. She acted within time itself. I prevented collapse. She prevented disappearance.
If I had stood where she stood, I might not have survived the court. I was not built for constant exposure.
If I had lived as she lived, I might not have been patient enough to wait for centuries.
I chose silence so that women could continue thinking.
I chose authority so that others would not have to.
History will ask, which of us was stronger? It will ask the wrong question.
Strength is not singular. It adapts to constraint.
Some women survive by learning how to bend.
Some survive by knowing when not to move at all.
If you are listening to us now, you live in a world where women speak openly. Do not mistake that openness for inevitability.
It was built by those who wrote, and those who decided, by those who endured, and those who contained.
I was one kind of power.
I was another.
Neither of us was free. Both of us were effective.
Listen carefully.
Listen carefully. History is not changed only by those who shout. Sometimes it is shaped by those
when
who remain
silence
calm,
is the only
when
safe language.
silence is the only safe language.